down to business.
That's the nectar of the gods, baby.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Whiskey Musings broadcast. I am your free-speaking host, Rick. Tonight I actually have a bit of a headache, and so I took some medicine earlier today, and therefore I am not partaking in the alcohol because, of course, public service announcement: you never mix medicine and alcohol together. Okay, so that being said and out of the way, you will see me sipping from a mug root beer. Okay, or possibly water, depending upon which way I happen to go. So tonight I actually would like to take on the prospect or the conversation with regards to free speech. President Biden has put out a couple of times in the last couple of weeks the analogy of the whole concept of yelling fire in a theater. And I have to admit that when I was a young kid, we also discussed that as part of the process. Like, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. So I kind of thought about that, and I said, well, wait a minute. Okay, so we have things like, we have Twitter, we have Facebook. They're censoring posts, depending upon what kind of post it is, according to their terms of service. And sometimes it's loosely translated, sometimes it's not. It just kind of depends. We have conversations about things like hate speech and that kind of thing. So I kind of thought I'd go ahead and sort of dive in and take a look at what kind, from a layman's perspective, what constitutes things like free speech, and do we actually have free speech here in America? Because some people say that we don't. So I'm going to try and address those things, try and address all those questions as we move along here. But before I get into that, I need to explain or actually give a shout out to my subscribers, as I always do. I appreciate it. I picked up a couple new ones this week. So welcome to the program. Hopefully you enjoy it and you enjoy the content that I am providing. For those of you that are unfamiliar with the way things work here on YouTube and other places, subscribers, likes, these are how content providers such as myself gauge how things are going with the content that we are providing. And so therefore, that is great feedback for us to get an idea in terms of what types of content you, as our viewers, would like to actually see and enjoy. So if you can do me a favor, if you like the information that I'm bringing, please go ahead and subscribe if you have not done so already. If you have the opportunity to go ahead and hit that thumbs up button, that is the like button. The thumbs down is the dislike button or unlike button. So I would appreciate it if you would go ahead and, use those forms of feedback to allow me and, of course, any other content providers that you have in your repertoire and that you're watching, to let them know how they are doing as well as how I am doing. Now, I also have a bit of a preview for you. I am very excited. I have my first interview of a third person, and I'm not talking about my very special co-host, Captain Unicorn. I don't necessarily consider him as much of an interview, even though he and I kind of banter back and forth. But that being said, I have my first interview, and it's coming up in next week's episode. I recorded it yesterday, and I think it's a public service announcement, something that you are going to hopefully be interested in. And I'm excited to bring it to you, just from the standpoint of it being the interview. The topic is very, very, very sobering. So just for that ahead of time. But the point is that it is very important that I get this information out to you. It is for a nonprofit organization, and they would like your support. So I'm going to air that next week. Look for that, and then also, join us on either the live stream or watch the video afterward. I think that's pretty much kind of catches everything up. So let's go ahead and get started, get jumping right into the program. So, free speech in America. It is part of our First Amendment. The First Amendment actually discusses several things. It discusses freedom of the press, freedom of religion. Notice it's not freedom from religion, but freedom of religion. The freedom and the right for the people to peaceably assemble. But it also has the freedom of speech. Now, as I've maintained before in other episodes, the Constitution is not necessarily a document that essentially hands out the rights given to the people from government. It is actually written and intended to let the government know what it can and cannot do. And it is from the idea of the framers, the Constitution is a contract between the people, the general public, and our federal government that basically tells the federal government, these are the things that we, the people, provide to you as options of power. And these are also things that you cannot do anything against us for. Now, some arguments have been in the past that, free speech, as an example, it does have some limitations. And these limitations have grown out of years and years of legislation and years of court cases and court law that have been argued within the court system. And so because of that, we have things that are out there that are potential myths, misnomers. They're things that people just generally accept, even though they may or may not be true. And one of those in particular has to deal with the point of yelling fire in a crowded theater. Now, President Biden has used this. In particular, he has used that as an argument, ironically, for the restriction of gun rights in the Second Amendment. But that made me think, because growing up, I also had the understanding that you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. And just by that phrase by itself kind of indicates that, you're not supposed to yell fire in a crowded theater. The challenge with that, though, is the fact that you actually can yell fire in a crowded theater, especially if there is actually a fire. So it's not illegal for you to yell fire in a crowded theater. Unfortunately, what is illegal, and where we kind of get into a bit of a problem with this, has to deal with the idea that it's the resulting action after you yell fire in a crowded theater that gets you into trouble. But before I go on to that, I want to give a little history about where the idea of yelling fire in a crowded theater came from. So several cases have come up throughout the years, over 100 years of court cases have come out with regards to free speech. One that was very, very, very recent here was the concept that CNN, among others, had a problem or had libel, I believe it was. It's either libel or slander. I can't really remember which one was which. We'll discuss that here in a minute. But it was against Nicholas Sandmann. And the legal argument there was whether or not CNN actually had the First Amendment right to say the things that they did about Mr. Sandmann. And again, this kind of goes back to that whole thing. If you yell fire in a crowded theater, that is not protected by the First Amendment. So where did that come from? Well, it actually stems from a court case that happened in 1919. It was Schenck versus the United States, and the comment that was made as a part of the resulting decision for it was done by the and I'm looking for his name here. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes put out that, the whole concept of that we suppress shouts of fire in a crowded theater. Now, in the timeline in terms of America, that particular time, there was several theaters. You were able to go to theaters. I mean, the early 1900s, you would go to theaters for your entertainment. And let's be honest, workmanship wasn't exactly the best in the buildings. There weren't things for safety requirements such as, exit signs and those kinds of things. And generally speaking, most of the places most of the theaters were built with very dry materials and that kind of stuff. So to have a fire in a theater, in fact, in multiple cases, they did have actual fires in theaters, and several hundred people did die because of fires in theaters. And so it became common practice that, if you were to yell fire, everybody would panic and the crowd itself would just go nuts. Now, most cases here in the U.S., especially now, if somebody yells fire in a crowded theater, you probably won't get the same response because of the fact that, most people are not necessarily offended, quote unquote, by this, just because of the fact that, fire, you would have sprinkler systems, fire suppression systems, and that kind of stuff. Safety has really come a long way since the 1900s. But it's in that particular opinion that Justice Holmes put in where he was talking about criminalizing the idea of yelling fire in a theater because of the resulting action from it. Now, part of the problem with this is that, we in terms of thinking about the legal ramifications of this, we don't necessarily separate the idea of the term of yelling the fire in the theater versus the resultant actions from it. And so, this sounds like a bit of semantics, and in reality, Charles Schenck, who came from the Schenck versus the United States, what he was, as a part of the case, what he was actually doing is he was taking leaflets and mailing them to, some men who had been drafted to serve in the military for World War I. Now, the problem was that President Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, was, got us into World War I, and he was unpopular because of his choice to go into World War I. And so that's how this particular case got all the way to the Supreme Court. The funny thing is that that case was actually more along the lines of Charles Schenck being brought up on charges of espionage, not necessarily free speech. The idea came from it, though, as to whether or not those leaflets were capable of Charles Schenck's speech at the time. And that's where Justice Holmes kind of mentioned that, well, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. The funny thing about that particular case was the fact that Justice Holmes actually kind of reversed his decision on that in some subsequent cases that came up. And actually 40 years after that case was heard after, 1919 was when it was heard, but 40 years later, it was actually, the ruling was overturned. But the idea of yelling fire in a crowded theater has stuck throughout time. So in essence, it is a bit of a myth. It is a myth in the fact that yelling the word fire in the theater is not the problem. The problem is the resultant action from yelling fire that somebody would be responsible for. So I, in theory, have the free speech right to go into a theater and yell fire. However, I would not be absolved of the consequences of doing so. In fact, and there was no fire. Let's put that into perspective. So, going in and yelling fire in a theater by itself, by its very nature by itself, is not the problem. The problem is the resultant action. And then, of course, whether or not I intended to actually cause harm by doing so. Now, we've seen that argument be made in a couple of other things here recently. For an example, January 6th, the president, at the time, President Trump, was giving a speech, and he basically said to the crowd, in terms of a quote, and I'm going to paraphrase a little bit here, but he basically said, we're going to march down to the Capitol and we are going to peaceably assemble and peacefully protest. Now, the argument was made that that statement was what triggered the whole events on January 6th. And that was the process or the idea that the impeachment trial was based out of, was that phrase or those statements were incendiary. And that's the key, is the incendiary nature of the wording that gets somebody going. Now, the same thing has happened with Maxine Waters. She has made statements, Representative Waters has made statements about getting into, conservatives' faces, cabinets' faces, those kinds of things. She has said some pretty interesting stuff, especially after George Floyd, talking about how if we don't get the proper verdict, we're going to get out in the streets. We're going to, we're going to get more active, get more, that kind of thing. And so there have been calls about that as a potential issue for, free speech rights. Now, she has the right to say that, just like President Trump had the right to say what he said. The problem comes in is whether or not the intent on that was supposed to be incendiary. Were they truly saying this with the idea of whipping up the crowd to get them going? And that's really where things are kind of hard to prove. And that's where things kind of get questionable in terms of the matter of free speech. Now, we've also had some other cases throughout our history where we've brought in things like, libel and slander and defamation of character. And all of these have pretty much been mainly focused on the resultant factor of the speech, not so much the speech itself, but what resulted because of it. That became a problem, just like I said with Nicholas Sandmann and CNN. So first of all, I do want to, because I mentioned this earlier, I do want to kind of go in and bring up, and I'm going to move this over here, and I'm going to go and take a look. Let's look at the definition, because I can never remember which one is which, but I'm going to take a look at the definition of libel and slander. Now, I'm looking up at Cornell Law School for this definition. So we're going to start with libel, and then we're going to go to slander, and then we're going to go to defamation. So really quickly, libel definition is a method of defamation, okay, expressed by print, writing, pictures, signs, effigies, so on and so forth. So libel is actually what CNN was accused of in the Nicholas Sandmann case, okay? And generally speaking, in order to prove that, you kind of have to show defamation. So let's jump to defamation and see what defamation says. So defamation is a statement by by Cornell Law's idea here for the definition, defamation is a statement that injures a third party's reputation. That, in and of itself, is exactly what happens when somebody goes who is accused wrongly of something. They are being accused of something they didn't do, let's say, and that can be considered defamation. And defamation of character is the common phrase that you hear out of this. So then let's take a look at what slander is. Now, slander is a false statement that's usually made orally, which defames, or attacks a third person's character, another person, And unlike libel, damages for slander are not presumed and must be proven by the party who is suing for that. So slander typically isn't what's done in the courts. It's usually libel, and libel has to deal with the written word. Now, you hear a lot of times, you'll hear stuff where people will be talking about how, if you're on Twitter or Facebook or something like that, and you make a statement there, that you could be sued for libel. And that is true. However, you have to understand that in order to be sued for that, you have to show, as I pointed out in the definitions, you have to show that it is defamation, that a third party or another person was defamed by this. And this is part of the reason why some of these cases are a little bit difficult to deal with. So again, it's not so much the speech or what was said that is the problem. It's the resultant act after that speech that becomes an issue. And we've heard and talked about things, anybody who's talked about free speech in America, we've talked about hate speech. We've talked about, the 1960s and the KKK and some of the, white supremacists and a lot of the conversations and things that happened back in those days. And especially now we're even getting to the point of the neo-Nazis and Antifa and BLM and all of these things. They are allowed to speak. That is part of their free speech process. But what seems to be consistent throughout all of these cases and throughout all of these legal agreements is whether or not that speech has done something to somebody else, a third party. And again, going back to defamation of character. So it seems that it is a little bit of a semantic issue in some people's minds, where free speech is a particular protected right, but yet not all speech is necessarily protected. But where it comes into a little bit of a fine line has to deal with the fact that if that speech, whatever it is that you said, caused some type of damage to a third party or some type of issue to a third party or resulted in specific damages to somebody else when you're talking about libel, slander, defamation. Okay. Now, it's kind of interesting because there's also another case where we talk about, in particular, where things have taken an interesting turn, and that deals with things like fighting words, as an example. Now, fighting words, according to, again, Cornell Law, they have been defined by the Supreme Court in the case of Chaplinsky, I think I'm pronouncing that right, versus New Hampshire. And what is defined as fighting words is words by their very utterance inflict injury or tend to incite an immediate breach of peace. It has been well observed that such utterances are no essential part of any exposition of ideas and are of such slight social value as a step to truth that any benefit that may be derived from them is clearly outweighed by the social interest in order and morality. End quote. Now, fighting words are not protected under the First Amendment. Okay. And basically, essentially what that is if somebody literally inflicts or says something like, you know, bad example here, but something like "let's fight," or, you know, calling a particular person a racial slur or a bad name or something along those lines. So fighting words are not protected by the First Amendment. And that seems to be a very specific and narrow viewpoint. And it's been put out there within relation to things with regards to free speech based off of SCOTUS's, and by SCOTUS I mean the Supreme Court, by the Supreme Court's decisions over the course of time. A couple of examples are that were in the I don't know. I can't pronounce it. But anyway, versus the city of Chicago in 1949, this particular case narrowed a little bit of the scope of what constitutes fighting words. And in this particular case, the court found that words that produce a clear and present danger are unprotected. Okay. So this kind of gives you a little bit of a definition of the whole idea of fire in a crowded theater, that the words themselves represented a clear and present danger to society or to the particular individuals at that point in time. Fighting words, they further said, are words that invite dispute and cause unrest. Wait a minute. So words that invite dispute and causes unrest are protected, and are not considered fighting words, according to that same decision. So you have to have a clear and present danger, according to this particular court case. So then Feiner versus New York in 1951 further brought this down. And it basically states that they said that it's an incitement to riot creates a clear and present danger. So this particular court case, or this particular case, is what a lot of people want to say that President Trump actually did. Although I can't figure out how the words peaceable and assemble, which is protected under the First Amendment, could actually be used. But any words that are designed specifically to incite a riot apparently is considered a fighting word problem and therefore unprotected speech. In Texas versus Johnson in 1989, the Supreme Court redefined the scope of fighting words doctrine to mean now words that are a direct personal insult or an invitation to exchange fisticuffs. So in this particular case, it is directly talking about somebody insulting you or calling you a bad name, bad word, whatever, and maybe telling you, hey, well, let's fight. That essentially gives you the idea of fighting words. Few different definitions based on the court cases, but it gives you an idea of what they're talking about when it comes to fighting words that are unprotected speech. Now, one thing that is protected that did come out of the Texas versus Johnson case in 1989 was that the court actually addressed specifically the burning of the United States flag, and they considered it symbolic speech and did not constitute fighting words. And I do kind of take a little bit of an argument about that. But it was that particular case that essentially brought out the whole idea of the burning of the flag as being protected under the First Amendment. And I know I've heard that throughout the course of my lifetime as well. Another case that they have is also, let's see, what is this? The RAV versus the city of St. Paul in 1992. the Supreme Court found that the First Amendment prevents government, and here's the key, prevents government from punishing speech and expressive conduct because it disapproves of the ideas expressed. But notice that that was expressly put towards government. So what we have going on today, in particular with places like YouTube and Facebook and some of these other places, government is actually the argument. So at this particular point in time, there are certain things that are not protected under the First Amendment based on several of these court cases, and some that are protected by the First Amendment. But it seems like it has a lot to do, and again, this is interpretation here, but it seems like it has a lot to do as to whether or not an individual is actually harmed by whatever that speech is. So essentially, you have the right to say what you want. You just don't have the right to be free of the resulting consequences. And this is where a lot of people get a little messed up when it comes to free speech, because of the fact that you absolutely, you have the right to say whatever it is that you want to say, but you're not free of the resulting consequences, especially when it represents a clear and present danger or defames somebody, or it's the government who is trying to silence you. And that's ultimately kind of where we're at. Now, what does this mean to private companies? Realistically, and again, I'll be completely honest with you, I don't have specific cases here, but there have been cases where somebody who is actually on the clock or wearing a particular person's or company's logo and representing the company does have the right to basically, terminate your employment as an extreme result. The company itself may take punitive action against you if you misrepresent that organization's, ideas, thoughts, goals, mission statements, whatever, while you're on the company clock. And there have been some cases across the U.S. that have done that. You can't necessarily claim free speech when you're on somebody else's dime. And that's something that is kind of interesting to say as well. So if I'm wearing my company uniform, let's say for an example, and I go to a political rally and my company finds out about it afterward, and they decide that because I'm at that political rally, and this is the key point, that I am in uniform, that is not a protection of the First Amendment, because I could be conceived as representing that organization. And because of my actions in that uniform, I could be defaming that company's character. And that falls into the unprotected item. So any kind of speech that you do, or any kind of, places that you go, places that you visit, rallies you attend, so on and so forth, be very mindful of the fact that you have to represent yourself as an individual. And I actually had this, ingrained in me when it came to the U.S. military. There were rules as a part of the Uniform Code of Military Justice that made it to where I could not wear my uniform to political party rallies or anything like that. I could not represent myself as a military person at those rallies, because if I did, and my actions were deemed inappropriate, then I could be brought up on charges under the UCMJ. Now that may have changed, because obviously you do see a lot of people who will go out and are in military uniform and so on and so forth. But I think most of the time, those individuals had received higher approval from their higher ups based on what it was that they were doing. So, realistically, do we have free speech? And I would have to argue that we do. The part that we don't have is we don't have the freedom to be free from any of the consequences with regards to that speech, provided that it harms somebody else or harms a third party in particular. Now, there's another aspect of this which has to deal with things like obscenity. And we've had a couple of cases that have popped up when in regards to things such as nudity, sexual acts, things of that nature, where there is free speech involved. Is that really part of free speech? And so, going back to Cornell law, obscenity is actually a category of speech that is not protected by the First Amendment. And obscenity laws that have been enacted are concerned with prohibiting lewd, filthy, disgusting words, pictures, indecent materials, or depictions. However, things like artistic impressions are kind of in that gray area. And it depends on, the restrictions that might be put in place in terms of the time and place, the manner, whether or not they are still protected by the First Amendment. And it becomes kind of a judgment call. And realistically, this depends on, ideally, what general people would consider obscene or would consider lewd, filthy, disgusting, so on and so forth. Now, this is kind of interesting because you have certain things where people get in trouble for doing things at certain times. And a perfect example would be, let's say, the whole Janet Jackson thing at the Super Bowl where she had her top ripped off. I mean, some people would think that was, lewd, filthy, and disgusting. And she, they did it as a publicity stunt. We've since kind of looked at it. But, that could be that particular action was not considered free speech. We also have, Cardi B and I think she calls herself Megan Thee Stallion. They have that song out called WAP. And if you've ever seen the video, I mean, and I did not watch the Grammys, but I heard about the Grammy Awards, where that was questionable at best. And there are people who kind of skirt the line. People would think, okay, well, that might be a artistic impression. I mean, we have nudes in artistry. We have the human body as part of artistry. Is that considered obscene, lewd, filthy, disgusting? Well, no. But at the same time, you do have porn magazines that are out. You have, things like Playboy that have gone into court on multiple occasions. You have, Hustler magazine or some other magazines that are out there that are, their product is protected somewhat by the First Amendment in certain cases. And again, a lot of this has to deal with the way that it is presented, when it is presented, who can get a hold of it. I know that there are limits in terms of who can buy those types of materials. You have the whole ratings system with movies and television programs, and even at one point it was rating system on music. And so a lot of this has fallen into the idea of the First Amendment rights, but obscenity is one of the things that is not protected by free speech, depending upon how it is perceived and received by the common public. Now, one other piece out of this is the government, and this is actually kind of interesting because I didn't actually really think that this was a thing. But according to, again, going back to Cornell Law, according to them, the First Amendment's free speech clause limits government regulation of private speech, but the interpretation of it does not restrict the government when the government speaks about itself. Okay? So this is kind of interesting because this is where a little bit, Cornell talks a little bit about, white supremacist rally as an example. So if the government allows private groups to hold rallies in a public park, this is the example that Cornell Law is bringing up. If they allow private groups to do it, they cannot exclude a white supremacist rally based solely on the idea that it disagrees with the rally message. Okay? But at the same time, the city itself is not required to include a white supremacist message when it holds a diversity program at schools. So, just because of the fact that the government itself can prevent certain things from being done in, say, schools or something like that, they also have the requirement where if they allow other people to say things, they do have to allow people who it doesn't necessarily agree with, they do have to allow them to have a platform or a place for speech to happen. And part of this is because of the fact that even though the government's not regulated by free speech, it is regulated by the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. So, unfortunately, in this particular case, it's not always clear whether the government is actually speaking on itself or unconstitutionally restricting some other's speech, some other private speech. So it becomes, again, kind of a gray area for this. And there have been a couple of cases that have dealt with this in particular. But unfortunately, the Supreme Court, even though there's only been a couple of cases, the Supreme Court hasn't yet stated, at least according to Cornell Law, hasn't yet stated a clear definition or a clear standard in cases with the government talking about itself. So we've got a lot of different things going on here with free speech. And, there's a bunch of other things that are out there as well. I mean, there's things about captive audiences. There's things about prior restraint. Let me pop this open real quick. Prior restraint basically means that the government's action prohibits speech or other expression before the speech happens. And that's the definition according to the Cornell Law. So it may be like a statute or a regulation that requires a speaker to access or acquire a permit or a license. It could also be a judicial injunction that prohibits certain speech. And so the prior restraint basically is allowed, it looks like. But certain statutes are not. So it depends on, so for an example, here near versus Minnesota in 1931, there was a statute that was passed, a state statute that was passed that was authorizing prior restraint against a news publication, and the Supreme Court actually held that such a statute is considered unconstitutional. However, the court did also find, though, that prior restraint may be allowed in certain exceptional cases, such as when the nation is at war or when the speech would incite violence. And again, as you notice, it has to be something where there is an apparent, clear, and present danger to either a third party or to something going on. It looks like the Supreme Court has been fairly consistent in this fact. So just by saying something doesn't mean that you're going to be a problem. You have to, in order to have your speech become unprotected, you essentially have to do something that would cause a clear and present danger to somebody else. It would cause things like incitement of a riot. It would be, defamation of character. So it looks like your speech is only restricted if that speech causes direct harm to some other entity, whether it's an individual or group of people or something along those lines. And that ultimately is where we're talking about. But again, keep in mind that this is only required for the state or the federal. Doesn't necessarily mean that platforms like YouTube or Facebook can't limit the types of speech that they put on their platforms. Even like right now, if YouTube were going to say, hey, you know what? We don't like what you're saying. We're going to limit your speech. Well, that becomes a bit of a gray area. And to be honest, the Supreme Court hasn't really had a case like that yet. Nobody has ever actually brought that up, other than the fact that if you are representing an organization, then it becomes a problem. But if you're just a private citizen using a platform, and this is where Section 230 kind of comes into play, because it turns into a definition of what a publisher would be, who can censor things and can modify what's going on, versus a platform, meaning that you are just openly allowing people to express themselves freely. And I have a feeling that especially in today's day and age, where you have certain conservative values that are being potentially limited and potentially restricted, that because this is YouTube and we have the technology age, this has become the new town square. It's no longer you going out into the town or the city and putting up a pulpit and standing on it and starting to speak and saying things to bring, the public together. This is the new platform, the technology platform. Being able to speak your mind on Twitter and Facebook and other social media sites is really and truly the push. And so I think that we're probably going to see some sort of a case come out of this. And especially now that, the Congress has already started to look at things like what Facebook has been doing, what YouTube has been doing. And even though we're under Democrat control right now in our administration, it's still cause for concern, because again, some of these platforms could be considered open and public forums, and that's what they argued for when they wanted the Section 230 protections. For those that don't understand what Section 230 is it basically means that somebody cannot sue YouTube for something that I, as a content creator, put out there, because they have asked to be considered a platform and not a publisher. So some of the arguments as to why Section 230 should still exist for these people depends upon whether or not you consider them a publisher or whether you consider them a platform. Because in some cases, they are actually acting like a publisher in terms of limitations on what they're doing. And it's not just things like, obscenity and nudity and violence and those kinds of things. Although there have been arguments and studies and people have found that there are groups that are like terror organizations, for an example, that are still utilizing the platform unrestricted, when other people who admittedly are not have been restricted. And this is where the argument comes into play. I would be willing to bet that somewhere in the near future, you're going to see a court case come up with regards to whether or not Twitter and Facebook and YouTube are considered standalone, or are they considered public platforms where anybody can just pretty much post what they want as long as it's within regards to the case law that has already been placed forward in terms of the idea of free speech. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that what Facebook and Twitter and YouTube are doing is wrong. I'm not saying it's right either, because the reality of the situation is, as looking at it from a freedom-loving American like myself, that the conundrum comes into play when you as an individual decide whether or not, first of all, that particular entity, whether it's Facebook or YouTube or Twitter, has the right to limit what they do as a part of their terms of service, versus do they really have the right to silence somebody's speech, provided that it doesn't fall outside of the certain terms of service. And this is where the rub comes into play, because again, those terms of service, unfortunately, are being applied strictly in some cases, but questionably loose in others. So this is kind of where we're at in our society. And I don't think the idea of, the whole free speech thing, because this is another argument that people have thrown out there, is that free speech, and in particular freedom of the press. Some people have said, well, if freedom of the press applies to back in the day, then that just means the printing press. It doesn't mean that it applies to technology as it is today. So it kind of depends on your definition of what the free speech idea is from a platform perspective versus things like the press, because the press could mean anything electronic communications. We have a lot of newspapers that are done electronically now versus print. And so, again, a lot of this breaks down in terms of definitions. But a lot of this also depends upon if somebody takes it to court and actually gets it all the way up to the Supreme Court. So ideally, what does all of this really mean? Well, essentially what it does mean from the standpoint of freedom of speech is that you are free to do say whatever you want, whether it is vile and disgusting versus, something that people agree with. The problem comes into play is when you try to censor what those people are saying, even if you don't agree with them. They still have the right to say it. But if it harms another person or causes a problem where there is, again, a clear and present danger to either third-party person or society as a whole, this is where it could potentially no longer be protected under the First Amendment. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is my final Whiskey Musings thought for the evening. Thank you very much for joining. If you like what I bring, the content I bring, once again, hit subscribe here on YouTube. Also, you can check out Rumble. I do post the videos up on Rumble afterward. So either way, you can find it at one of both of those locations. I do appreciate your time. As always, I know that your time is valuable, and I appreciate you spending it here with me to listen to what I have to say. Do me a favor, if you like my content, hit subscribe, hit the notification bell here on YouTube to be able to be notified when I go live or when I post a video. Don't forget to check out next week, my very first interview with a third party. This is going to be great. The subject matter is very sobering, but it is a public service announcement, and I really would appreciate you helping out this 501c3 organization in their quest to help within to help prevent some of the criminal elements that we're dealing with. You'll have to watch the video in order to understand more, but I'm excited about that. Well, I guess that's about it. Have a good weekend, and thank you very much for joining. And you have a wonderful night. Good night, all. We'll catch you next time on the Whiskey Musings broadcast.